Hey guys, it's Mike. We're getting back to the 944 project. If you're just joining us, this is my 944 that was a former winter beater, and we're turning it into a rally monster. We've swapped in 5-cylinder 07K, turboed it, built the cage, chassis is good to go, and today we're going to show you a month and a half of wiring in about
22 minutes.
So at this point, I have the chassis of the car rewired and pretty much back together. I stripped down the entire harness front and rear, pulled out anything I didn't need like dome lights, there's a bunch of radio harness stuff, AC things, and stripped down the harness to the bare essentials. And then while I was at it, I incorporated a bunch of the new stuff we're gonna use with the new standalone. So I have an ethanol sensor in the back, I rewired the fuel pump, I've incorporated all the fog lights up front, pulled out a bunch of wiring that was in the engine bay. So all that's together and tidy. Next up is making the engine harness. I just got these 10-foot pigtails with the Mega Squirt. It looks daunting, and at some points it kind of is, but it does leave you with a nice solution that fits what you're working on. So I have a whole bunch of notes. I'm making sure I've got all my stuff sorted. I really only want to do this once, so I don't want any splices, any kind of like hack job wiring stuff. I'm trying to figure it all out, pin everything nice with brand new connectors, and have a really reliable setup. I know wiring like this can look daunting, and it's definitely not everyone's favorite thing, but you know, these harnesses are really nice and everything's labeled. If you lay everything out ahead of time and kind of label your stuff and figure out links accordingly, you can come up with a really nice, clean solution. I've learned to actually enjoy wiring like this, especially with all brand new stuff. It's really nice to kind of lay out your harness, figure out where your junctions are going to be, and have a really nice finished product. Definitely not for everyone, and I wouldn't recommend this as your first wiring project, but we'll be back in operation in no time. So the engine harness is done. I've tested all the outputs, kind of made sure all my coils are in the correct firing order, all that works. I've tested it with the Mega Squirt itself. I can't really talk you through all of the wiring on camera. It's just not feasible, especially depending on what you're doing. But I will say, making a little spreadsheet of like your ECU pins and all your sensors and what they need for voltage and grounds and stuff like that is really important. Kind of do the legwork first, it makes your job a lot easier. Also, if you've ever tried to rewire Volkswagen connectors, you'll know that Volkswagen superseded all the terminals to a little pre-crimped wire. And if you're trying to make a wiring harness, that sucks. So now we have a bunch of the Volkswagen connectors. Selfishly, it's all the ones I needed for this right now. So we have all the connectors with the crimp-on pins and the little grommets available. Those are coming soon. We'll have a link in the description for that. But if there's any other connectors you want, let us know. We can add those too. But I have the crank sensors, knock sensors, you know, the cam phaser solenoid, all sorts of stuff that I needed for this. So that's all brand new connectors on this engine, not reusing any of that. All right, for this project, I wanted to use all the stock gauges. I really like the look on this car, and they're kind of a really neat, classic appearing setup. So I have the factory tach working, I have my temperature gauge working with the original sender. I made an adapter for that. Oil pressure stuff, battery light, all that works. There's a separate oil gauge in these factory. I took the AC knob out because I don't have AC anymore and put the wideband gauge there. So that's my interface for that. I did want more information for that, for the car, than just that stuff though. I don't trust the factory coolant gauge other than a quick glance. I don't know what number that is. There's a handful of other things I'd like to know. So that's why I got this Raspberry Pi dash set up. I 3D printed a little mount for that. 3D scanned the dash, designed it quick, 3D printed it, made sure all that works. It's not completely finished yet. I haven't updated the software on it, but it's in and looks the part. Because I'm gonna be on loose traction surfaces, I made a little switch panel here so I could control boost, which is handy. That way if, things are slipperier than I wanted, or, maybe it's grippier than I wanted, I can up the boost a little bit or bring it down. I can set that up with tables in the software. I got these little 0 to 5 volt knobs here, so that's providing a voltage out from this potentiometer, and they do click and hide so that way I don't bump them accidentally. I have another one for launch, and that's my launch RPM, and that only works when I have this button on the e-brake depressed. So that way I can stage the car, hold the car in position with the e-brake, grab the button, rev it up, build boost, and then be ready to go and launch away. So that way I can control RPM for different areas, if I were on tarmac or if I were on gravel or a dusty area or just loose sand, I'm gonna want different RPMs. So I can play with all that on the fly. Also, I've got a little switch here for anti-lag. We're gonna have to go over the process of that, but I want, not a launch control style anti-lag, a true anti-lag where every time I'm decelling, the car is building boost and ready to go for the next time I'm on the throttle. There's a bunch of settings for that. I know that the button works, but we're gonna have to tune a bunch of that later. The only other two switches here are for the fog lights. I've got those nice big hellas up front. So I've got an inner lights and an outer lights because they're gonna be aimed differently, and depending on what I need to see or if there's snow or something, I wanna toggle them independently. I did get nice little laser etch switches. I designed a little 944 nose with fog lights lit up. So if you look really close, it's actually the car, which is pretty cool. The only other safety item I needed was a master kill switch. I put that in the center console here. Per the rules, both the driver and the co-pilot need to be able to access that switch. So if I'm knocked out, the co-pilot's knocked out, we can both access that switch. You have to have cables on the outside of the vehicle for killing power and the fire suppression. So this is the only place I could find that worked. It's like a compromise of not letting the wipers grab them, not letting the hood touch them when they come up, and fitting through the cowl here. So I 3D printed a little bracket so that way they fit nice, because I had to put a little angle on them. But they all work. The fire guy still has the pin in it, and we'll have the pin in it for a while, so no one around here comes and pulls the cable. So with this Megasquirt setup, I have a bunch of different features that I can add, and there's a ton of IOs to use. So I've added some extra features that you normally wouldn't see. One of them being this vacuum pump here, which is for my vacuum brakes. I'm not using intake manifold vacuum to pull a vacuum on here, which is what you traditionally see, because in a rally setting or a race setting, if I'm left foot braking while I'm on the throttle at all, or if an anti-lag is running, I won't have enough intake vacuum to pull a vacuum on the brake system. So these little electric pumps are pretty common. You can pull them out of a bunch of random things. This is like a GMC Traverse or something like that. They have a little sensor here, so that's why I had to wire it into the ECU, because this isn't a switch, it's an actual sensor, so I had to set up the vacuum threshold to toggle this on and off. Luckily, I had a million IOs that I didn't know what to do with, and that was a great use for one of them. On top of that, I'm using an electronic boost controller. So I've got this little MAC valve over here. That way I can use a different boost setting depending on what fuel I'm on, or with the little knob in the center, and control a bunch of that, and set up a bunch of safeties where if the car's running too hot or something like that, I could pull boost. So a bunch of those safeties mean a lot and really help the longevity of everything. I added a fuel pressure sensor here, which I'm not going to do too much with tuning wise. You can control fuel pressure with some different pump strategies. For me, it's just a good thing to log, and that way I can see what's going on. I can pull it up on my little Pi dash and troubleshoot on the fly. I had a bunch of spare stuff, so that's a good one. Same with oil pressure. I have the one for the factory gauges, and I have one to the ECU. I'm going to set up a bunch of safeties for oil pressure because that's really important. On top of that, there's an ethanol sensor near the tank. So that way I can map blend for E85 or 93 pump gas. So I can tune on the dyno for each fuel and have it blend in between, so that way, depending on what I get out of the pump, it'll run correctly. That's going to take some time to tune correctly, but I wanted that provision here and ready to go, so when I need it, I can set that up. This is Tuner Studio, which is the software interface for Megasquirt. So the reason I went with Megasquirt is it's a very versatile software solution that I've used before, so I'm relatively familiar with it. There's a million different settings and a million different ways to configure everything. There's no base map for this 5-cylinder, so we're going to have to set everything up from scratch. But you know, there's a bunch of tables and settings, so you can go through your sequential settings. I had to set it up to be a 5-cylinder, number of strokes, kind of set up the firing order, as well as like crank trigger settings. There's just a ton of things you need to do before you even try to start it. You can see I pulled up a handful of gauges here. These are my sensors and what they're currently reading. So that's a good gut check to know everything's wired correctly and that those things will work. So I'm going to have to go through all the fuel settings and pull up tables, like this is the V8 table, and I'm going to have to set all that up, which is going to be a bunch of tuning on the dyno. You know, this wasn't a turboed application for this motor originally. I've turboed it, I've changed a bunch of things. It's got a bunch of aftermarket parts in it that I want to protect and save. So a bunch of those safeties are the most important thing to me. A standalone, in the grand scheme of things, is pretty cheap when you consider, you know, if I set up an oil pressure safety that an OE, computer wouldn't have, if I set that up correctly, it'll save an engine with thousands of dollars of parts in it. So preventing damage to things and preserving that while being able to tune it for whatever I need is the reason I decided to go with a standalone over any factory option. You can't just like dive in knowing nothing about tuning or ECUs and just jump right into hooking up a standalone on your car. Now, specifically in this application where this isn't a plug-and-play solution. I had to wire everything. There isn't an option for this motor in this chassis like this. There are options where you can get, a plug-and-play solution for your E36 or something like that. Megasquirt has a great option for that. That plugs into the factory ECU plug. You don't have to do any wiring. They come with a base map so you can fire it up and play around. That's a great option. It's a lot less daunting than trying to dive in to this extent. But just do your research, play around, be methodical with your variables, don't change everything at once. That's a great way to get in trouble and have your car not start. So another thing I did was I pre-lubed the engine, and to do that, I used one of our Schwalben brake pressure bleeders. I tapped the end of the fitting and then used that as an oil pressure vessel to prime the motor. So it's a great use of a relatively inexpensive thing to save some expensive parts. So now I know it's all pre-lubed and ready to go. I've already cranked it and verified my sensors. I do have oil pressure. So from here out, it's going to be me messing with sensors and signals, trying to make sure I have the crank trigger stuff set up correctly. My maps work out. It's going to take some fiddling around to get anything to start, but I'm going to play with it for a little bit and see what we can do. I'm going to be honest with you guys, this is not the first start. What you're not seeing is me cranking this for 2 days, trying to figure out why I didn't have sufficient crank signal. Trying a bunch of different things, blowing tiny fuses in the ECU, ordering those fuses as replacements, fixing that, and then we're coming to realize that, so essentially the issue was the signal from these crank sensors wasn't a strong enough signal for the ECU, which is pretty common. Had I looked at enough factory wiring diagrams or back probed some stuff, I probably could have figured this out first, but I didn't. So I needed to add pull-up resistors to both the crank and cam signal. Now a pull-up resistor takes a signal, say, this is doing a square wave. If you were to graph the voltage, it goes from 0 up to what we were getting was 2.5 volts. The ECU needed more volts than that to read. So you take the signal line and put a resistor to 5 volts. So that takes that whole signal jump and offsets it higher. So now I have a stronger signal that the ECU can read, and voila, I had crank signal. After that, it was me messing around with a bunch of settings I set up incorrectly to get it to get, what they call RPM sync. So this is a composite logger, as you can see. And green is the cam signal, blue is the crank signal, and then red is sync loss. So you can see all these red spikes here are while the engine's cranking, and it's not going fast enough to synchronize between the cam and the crank. So that's a sync loss event. So that won't run. Then they sync together once it was at a high enough RPM. You can see it goes from slow, they get tighter together as the engine's speeding up. This is just while I'm cranking. Then it fires and everything gets smooth. So each one of these bumps is a tooth on the reluctor wheel of the crank. This has a 60-tooth wheel that the sensor is picking up with a 2-tooth window where there's no teeth. So this is the 2-tooth window. There's 60 teeth here, then 2 missing teeth. Oh, it's not, okay, so it's 58 teeth here, and then the 2 missing teeth, so that's the gap. So it knows that's a full revolution of the crank at each one of those gaps. And this is the cam signal changing for each of those. So long story short, it starts now. So this is the idle pulse width for the throttle body. So I had changed a couple things. So this is the warm-up curve. So when the engine's colder, like this is the temperature down here, when the engine's colder, the throttle body needs to be open more to hold an idle. As it warms up, that goes away. So this is it bumping down its steps here. Which I still have a bunch of work to do here, and until it's completely tuned, it doesn't really matter. Like it matters a little bit, I'm just trying to rough it in now. Once we have everything tuned and dialed in on the dyno, then I'll go through all these final touches again to get a nice cold start and then a nice hot start. But just trying to get it so it's not revving too high right now. All right, so as the engine's warming up, I'm kind of just monitoring a couple things. It doesn't make sense to tune too much until you get everything up to temperature. So I'm really not changing too much other than keeping it running and happy. I'm mostly watching to make sure the coolant temp stays good and we bleed out all the air pockets. This is an OBD2 VR6 throttle body, which has this electronic actuator on the side for idle. So what that does is it uses the first 20% of the throttle opening to control idle with this electric motor, and then the cable to control the rest. So that's how you typically have it wired. I'm doing things slightly differently. The main goal for me is I want to use the throttle body for anti-lag. Anti-lag is to keep the turbo spooled up while you're decelerating. So with this system, through the standalone, I can command the throttle body to be open with that idle actuator as much as possible, and then I can misfire the engine in a round-robin pattern, and then pull a bunch of timing to ignite all those extra fuel vapors in the exhaust manifold. So I'm not producing power with those combustion events, I'm just spooling the turbo and keeping it ready to go, so I'll build boost quicker the next time I need it. So for me to do that successfully, I'm working on getting this to a hot idle. That's when you need the least amount of air, when everything's warmed up and running for a little bit. So at a hot idle, I want the throttle body to be completely closed and I want it to idle. In order to get that to happen, I'm drilling this small bleed hole here And I'm playing with that as it's warming up. I'm gonna make it bigger and bigger until the engine idles. That way, all the way closed will be enough air for it to idle on its own. And when I command it to be open with the ECU, it'll be open a little bit and I can use that for anti-lag. So I'll have the most amount of air I can use. All right, so now we can test some of the buttons here. So launch, that lights up my little green light there, which is nice. Then I have this RPM set all the way down, but you can rev it up till. And I'm not letting it build boost right now, but once properly tuned, that'll build boost. And then I can set different RPMs to get it to rev higher or lower. As soon as you let go, you take off. Another thing is the anti-lag button. I don't have any of this tuned yet. I just want to make sure the button works. So it'll start loping, which is just starting to get into those maps.
So you liking what you're hearing? Or?
Yeah, sounds great. We're pretty close. Obviously, there's a ton of tuning to do, and just tuning it sitting here idling isn't great, so that's not very useful. Most important thing I'm just watching, make sure coolant temp works, make sure all my buttons work. Then from there, I'm just super motivated now that it runs, throw the rest of the car together and get this thing on the dyno.
Damn near got a race car here, Mike.
It's a race car. Well, almost a race car. So yeah, big deal. Car's wired, everything works, engine runs. So all that's super motivating. Next up, you're gonna see we have a bunch of odds and ends that we obviously still need to wrap up. But now I'm really motivated to crank through them, so that'll be the next video. Make sure you follow me at Mike the Day and follow us at ECS Tuning, and we'll see you guys next time. Dang it.
What happened?
I suck.